Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. It's great to be here and talk about horses. That used to be my day job, and I haven't gotten to do it in a while. But I'll get into that in a sec. So tonight we're going to talk about equine pasture management and pasture nutrition. They're inextricably tied together. And you might see at the bottom there, Shayan Ghajar, blah, 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 organic pasture and forage specialist. What's this guy doing talking about horses? Well, my job used to be conducting equine pasture nutrition research at the Virginia Tech Middleburg Agricultural Research and Extension Center. And that acronym actually works out to VT Mare Center. We did have some geldings too, but it was a pretty convenient little coincidence. At that center, we focused on a lot of different topics, anything from feeding acetaminophen, so Tylenol, to horses to see if that would mitigate symptoms of pain and inflammation to looking at different ways to address pasture-associated laminitis. So, though my title now is organic pasture and forage, most of the research I've ever done has been equine related. And beyond the research, and on the left, you can see some diapers that horses are wearing for a digestibility trial, and it was sub-zero weather there. So that's why I threw that picture in. It was kind of one of the things you don't think about. People think lab coats for research, but in that particular study, it was sub-zero temperatures, burst pipes, a flooded barn, and a lot of frozen pee in a horse diaper. So very glamorous life that I chose. But on the hobby side, the horse you see in the middle photo and on the right is my mare. She's going to be 22 in a month. Yeah, May this year. So she's back in Virginia. Unfortunately, she's got Cushing's, and being 21 presently, I didn't feel I could cart her across America without being a pretty selfish and irresponsible guy, because she's had laminitis in the past. So I'll visit her hopefully soon. It's been a while. But yeah, very horsey despite the organic pasture and forage title. So I'll start it off with this this graph, and if anyone's got a guess as to what that is, drop it in the chat. I'll give it 10 or 15 seconds and then keep on rolling. But feel free to just drop a little guess in the chat there. Be brave. It's okay to be wrong. It's better to be brave and wrong than quiet and not wrong. One guess was alfalfa. It's not too far off. I'm an impatient fellow. We got an hour, so I'll just crank on back to the answer. It's the percent of equine daily needs, nutrient needs met by pasture. So this is an example pasture, kind of an aggregate taken from different pasture samples and put into one kind of graph. But the hypothetical horse here is 1,100 pounds, ridden once or twice a week, and kind of in its teen years. So for a lot of people, that's going to sound familiar. And this is what needs are met by pasture. And if you look across the board, it's pretty much met or exceeded by pasture until you get to zinc. That one's deficient. There's a 1% deficiency on copper, and then selenium's deficient too. So this will be different depending on where you are, what your forages are, your soils, and things like that. But I think it kind of sets the stage for us to think about how much of our horses' needs are addressed directly by the grass under their feet. So horses evolved to meet most of their needs with grazing. That's pretty intuitive, but at the same time, it's something I think a lot of people stray away from. 1.5 to 3% of the horse's body weight is what they're going to eat per day. So if you're an 1,100 pound horse, that's 17 to 33 pounds of dry matter per day. So around 20 to a little under 40 pounds of hay per day, for example. And feral populations, like horses that are descended from domestic ones and released into the wild. Oh, we have a blue streak across the screen. Is anyone else seeing that? That's interesting. Anyway, sorry about that. But feral populations and pasture-boarded horses graze 14 to 18 hours per day. That's pretty consistent. There's horses in a marshland in France. I think it's about 14 or 12 hours a day for them. Wild horses off of the coast of Virginia, 13, 14 hours a day in summertime and 18 in winter. So it's pretty consistent around the world, regardless of breed, regardless of location. Horses almost always graze 14, 18 hours per day. And even in small to medium pastures, horses can get around quite a bit, 5 to 10 miles per day just grazing. And the picture on the right with the blue streak, which was not originally there, I'm not sure how that happened. I think it's a zoom feature. That's a stallion in Mongolia. I took that photo in central Mongolia in 2018. But that's basically where horses evolved, is that kind of landscape. It's almost no trees, very wide expanses, long distances between water bodies, very low growing grass, and only a few months a year where the grass is actually green, and the rest of the year it looks like that. So uh, when we think about what our horses evolved for thousands and millions actually of years, it's that kind of landscape. And when you think about what Oregon looks like and what much of the US looks like with improved pasture grasses, that's not what we're feeding our horses, but we can still make it work. And that's what we'll talk more about today. Is there a way to get rid of this blue line? Sorry about that, but that's I thought we'd move past it with the slide. Oh, thank you. I've never seen that before. I didn't know how to deal with that. I see Melissa solved that, so thank you, Melissa. So what are the benefits of a pasture-based diet? Pretty much countless benefits. Optimal nutrition, as we talked about, it reduces colic and digestive disorders because, as many of us know, hopefully not through firsthand experience, impaction colic is a pretty big risk rather of feeding a lot of hay for a long time. Pasture can also reduce gastric ulcers. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that because maybe that one's not so intuitive. Reduces respiratory disease because your horse isn't stuck in the barn all the time, breathing in fumes from the sawdust and bedding. And increases bone mineral content in young growing horses. There's a lot of research to show that pasture is the best place to raise a foal because of the exercise and also the nutritional profile of the pasture. And promotes normal, healthy behavior. If you have a big pasture for your horse, cribbing's not as much of an issue a lot of the time. Not always, but usually it reduces that kind of thing. And ultimately, it reduces the costs of feed when managed properly with grazing. So a little bit more on the ulcers, just because that might kind of raise some eyebrows, but when I talked about that 14, 18 hours of grazing per day that horses do pretty much around the world, when you think about that, they evolved for this. Horse stomachs are not like human stomachs. When we eat, then our body responds and secretes acid. With horses, because they're almost always eating, their body never evolved that kind of reaction. It just secretes gastric acid all the time. And so if a horse is not eating feed constantly, their stomach pH will go down to 1.6, which is, if you don't know a lot about pH, that's very acidic. And if they have a little bit of forage in them, then it's a pH of 4, which is, it's acidic, but in a good way. It's like the right kind of Goldilocks zone of acidic for a stomach, where you're not going to be inducing the stomach linings to wear away and perforate and cause issues. So one kind of constant thing to keep in mind, whether it's pasture or feeding hay in the barn or whatever with horses, is even if a horse needs to be put on a diet for weight management, they should always have food available. We just would slow down the rate of the food going into them, but they still need to always have that food there. So that's a kind of a sidetrack thing, but gastric ulcers are a pretty big problem for a lot of horse owners, and one of the first things off the bat that pasture is good for usually is fixing that. We used to take a lot of the research horses that we had, they were rehomed off-track thoroughbreds, and usually the research farm where I used to work would be their first stop after the racetrack. And those guys were just chock full of ulcers, and put them out on pasture for a few months, let their hooves get used to feeling actual grass underneath them, and pretty soon their stomachs clean up and they, oh goodness. was trying to think we should have like a community art thing going on with the slides. Uh, Anyways, yeah, but the ulcer reduction is a pretty big benefit to pasture. That said, what are the dangers of pasture? There are two big ones. A lot of people add a third one, which is they can have accidents in the pasture. And I don't know about y'all, but in my experiences, horses can have accidents pretty much anywhere. So I'm not going to put that one down for pasture as a point against it. The two big ones are poisonous plants and pasture-associated laminitis. I should have put there because laminitis can happen in the barn too, but pasture-associated laminitis happens only in the pasture, as the name suggests. And most people working in extension, most people are worried about the first one. Like they'll always, if you have a talk like this one about pastures or how to manage farmland, most questions you'll get will be about weeds and poisonous plants. But to be honest, most of your horses are in danger from laminitis more than the poisonous plants. Not to downplay the poisonous plants, that's definitely, horses die from those too, but a lot more horses die across the United States from laminitis than from eating something um, with a chemical compound that's directly toxic to them with their liver or kidney or something. So just keep in mind that laminitis is something to really focus on just as much as poisonous plants when you're thinking about pasture management. And we will dive into that a lot tonight. Kind of in the theme of where we pay attention to things. Here's a George Morris quote. I don't know if y'all know who he is, but he's pretty famous in the hunter world. And he said, "Love means attention, which means looking after the things we love. We call this stable management." And that kind of mindset is really, on the one hand, fully agree with him. But then that mindset is stopping at the barn door. And you see that a lot where it's like, everything about the barn is really meticulous from a person. Like they manage the organizational situation very intently. They know every supplement that their horse gets, how much they get um, every time the horse sneezes. But then if you ask them, like, how do you manage your pasture or what's in your pasture? It's a big, I don't know. And that's something that we need to work towards fixing tonight. So we're going to focus on the two aspects of this tonight pretty intuitively, the pasture and the horse, and keeping both healthy. And first, we're going to focus on the pasture. And that blue line I actually did draw for once. So we're, we're making progress. So basically, we need to take an inventory. If we want to get to know what's outside the barn door, we need to know what soils are there, what plants are there, how much forage we're growing, and how much forage we need. The soils thing, that's a whole class in itself. And I'm really going to cop out here and say, do a soils test. And if you don't know how to do that or what that is, email me or email Melissa or Haley or whoever your agent is, and we will walk you through that process. It's pretty straightforward, and we've got a lot to cover tonight. So I'm just going to say do one. It's super important and very easy, and you'll learn a lot. But we'll talk more about the other three, what plants, how much forage, and how much do you need, starting with the supply and demand side of things. We need to balance pasture productivity and equine needs. So if you think of your pasture like a bank account, you need to have enough coming into the account to balance what's going out. Otherwise, you're going to be in debt, and that's a debt that you'll definitely literally pay when you have to buy it. So how do we know how much is growing in our pasture? There's a lot of ways that we measure it directly. The most accurate ways involve some time and labor, usually clipping and drying out grass and things like that. There's other ways to do it, like plate meters, pasture sticks or grazing sticks, and even these days we're developing technology to do that with satellites. But a lot of this is probably going to be kind of too much work for many people with busy schedules. But if you do want to learn more about those and have an exact number for your farm, email me and I'll walk you through it, and possibly even do a farm visit if you're within a reasonable driving distance. But for us, we can kind of settle for some common yield ranges for the Willamette Valley. On the low end, unproductive and unirrigated pastures or kind of hilly pastures that are really well drained, those are going to be usually on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 pounds of grass per acre, and that's grass without the water weight. So essentially, even more dry than hay. So that's 4,000 to 5,000 pounds per acre of just the solid part of the grass without the water. The kind of middle ground there is 6,000 to 8,000 pounds per acre for unirrigated but still pretty productive pastures. And then on up with the irrigated pastures, you can get 8,000 plus pounds per year. So they're pretty wide range there, but if you kind of think about what pastures you're working with, do you have a lot of hill slopes and no irrigation? You're probably in the 4 to 5. Do you have a lot of flat land or land that's close to a river and kind of gets irrigation the natural old-fashioned way? That might be 6,000 to 8,000 pounds per acre. If you have irrigation rights and really cranking out some forage and have good soil fertility, 8,000 and on up. So we'll just use those ballparks. Once you have kind of an idea of where you are on that, a lot of people want to know, like, should I overseed my pasture? Is my pasture healthy? How do I know which direction my pasture is going? But this publication is from the NRCS. It's the Pasture Condition Scoring Guide. This one's pretty approachable and straightforward, and it has a few pretty intuitive things about it. Desirable plants, they should be the majority of what's out there. You should have mostly the ground covered, not a lot of bare ground. A diversity of plants is ideal because that can bring a diversity of nutritional benefits for animals and a lot of resilience because some plants are more tolerant to flooding, some are more tolerant to drought. So ideally, they say you should have 4 to 5 forage species representing 3 functional groups. A functional group is just like what category of plant it is. Is it a grass? Is it a legume? The ones that fixate nitrogen into the soil related to like peas and beans and things like those? Or is it a broadleaf forb, but not a weed, like a useful one that maybe our horse will eat? And then for plant residue, that's just kind of back in the category of we don't want bare ground. We always want to have some ground cover so that when it rains heavily, as it always does in Oregon, except in summer, we don't get runoff and we don't lose our soil and lose the benefits of the productive soils that we have. So these are all pretty straightforward concepts, but it's also, for me, I always find it really useful to have a sheet that's just laid out like this where I can circle which category it is and then come back to it and say, oh yeah, this is 40 to 60% good forage species, but our ground cover is a little bare or something like that. And then I can make a plan from there. I'm just the kind of person who needs something in writing. Maybe some of you are too. And I find this worksheet is a pretty easy way to explicitly list, like, this is what I'm looking for in my pasture. And yeah, our goals along with that sheet, very straightforward. We want useful forage species. We don't want weeds. And we want pasture to match our horses' needs. And we want to save money while we're doing it. So keeping in mind the productivity, the supply and demand part of this, we can dive into a lot of math here. It's not as dense as it looks on this sheet, I promise you. We know that horses will need 2 to 3% of their body weight per day. So if you have an 1,100-pound thoroughbred eating 2% of their body weight per day, and that's 22 pounds of grass that they'll want per day. So 8,030 pounds of grass that they'll want per year. If you have a good pasture, unirrigated, but kind of in the flatter part of the valley, think maybe you have 6,000 pounds of dry matter per year. Then we only graze half of that. We have 3,000 pounds per acre usable forage. And what that comes out to is it takes 2.7 acres per year to feed that one horse. So that's kind of the more detailed version of how do I balance the supply and the demand with the pasture. If you don't like math, here's the simpler version. Think back on your farm and ask yourself, does the grass ever grow taller than my ankles? And I mean in places that the horses haven't pooped, because if it's where they pooped, you're cheating. I mean, has it grown past your ankles where the horses have been actively grazing before? And And that photo to the right is kind of a joke. We don't want grass that's that tall. That's not ideal. But uh, we do want to kind of think, yeah, have I hit knee height? Have I hit shin height? Is it past the ankles? Because at that point, it means you're past kind of the 4-inch zone, which a lot of grasses um, need for survival, which I'll talk about more in a bit. And then also think if you see any patterns in your pasture with grass height. Are there some areas that they're really hitting hard, grazing like a golf course where you have the roughs and the greens, the putting green in one spot and then the roughs in the other areas? Because that means that part of your pasture is not being used. It means if you look at this kind of childish diagram, that was the best I could do, on the bottom right, you'll see that the light green is kind of the putting green. The horses are grazing there. There's some water and a gate down in the south of the pasture. So they're just kind of grazing around the water, grazing around the shed, and that's it. And then the east and the west side of the pasture, not really being used. So 50% of your forage there is wasted, and 50% is stressed out. So that's something that we need to fix. And why do we need to fix that? Well, grass has these things called growing points. Apical meristem is one of the fancy terms for it, but it's just the point with stem cells in it, in the stem, actually, so kind of fits, where the grass grows. So grass doesn't grow like a tree with rings going outwards. It grows from that one point and kind of expands. So if you graze that point, if you graze below that point rather, then the grass has to send up an entirely new shoot or tiller of grass to grow again. If you graze above that, it can keep growing from that very same shoot or tiller of grass. So in other words, it'll have to reinvest in a completely new plant if you graze below the growing point. But if you graze above the growing point, it could just start back up again pretty much as soon as you're done, with enough time to regrow. So growing height is really darn crucial for the grass. Here's kind of a if this lens. You can see what I'm talking about, the way the grass is growing there. It's not growing like a tree. It is growing from that one spot. So you can see if you graze below that growing point, the grass would have to start all over. But since it was cut above the growing point, there's new grass almost instantaneously. And how do we know where that is? And why is that different? I mean, why is that important from the soil angle too? Well, if you graze more than half of most species of grass, then they stop growing anything with their roots. They have to reallocate all of their carbohydrates to regrow. And so the root growth will stop. And when root growth stops, that means the grass is kind of stalled out. But if you graze only 50%, you've barely slowed the root growth at all. And that has to do with those growing points as well. So below ground, if you're meeting that kind of 50-50 ratio with your grazing, below ground, your soil is still getting the benefits of healthy sod. So carbon sequestration and improved water infiltration and things like that. Whereas if you're overgrazing, going below the forage mark for a lot of grasses, then you're not going to have as healthy soil or as healthy roots in the soil. So here's some more details on grazing height. Species is on the left, and then the start grazing is the middle column, and the stop grazing is the column on the right. So for the tall, cool season grasses, that's grasses that grow in spring and fall. Got orchard grass, that's common here. Clackgrass, reed canary, smooth brome, tall fescue, and timothy. Every single one of those grasses grows in the Willamette Valley. Some are more or less common than others, but for all of those, 8 to 10 inches is where, for the grass's sake, it's a good time to start grazing, and then you should really stop grazing the grass, pull the horses off, or move them to a new pasture around the 4-inch mark. That's true for some legumes as well. And then the ryegrasses, you can hit them a little harder, around 6 to 8 inches. You start sooner on those, and then end at the 2-inch mark instead of 4. So those ones you can crop a little bit more down to the ground. And the warm season grasses, almost none of those grow here except for the sorghum Sudan, and that one horses should not graze. So we'll ignore those for now. And you may be saying at this point, well, that's great, but I don't know what pasture species I have. And that's a great thing to start learning. In fact, it's pretty darn essential. And there's a lot of places to learn it, and we'll go over a few. But what do we focus on first? We want to learn about the dominant grass species first, pretty intuitively. If you're seeing a lot of something out there, start with that one. Um, and then it's good to learn legumes and forage broadleaf species that may help diversify your pasture. And it's definitely good to learn if you see a lot of kind of weedy looking species, um, learn those because those usually indicate something you should change about your management, or maybe your soil is too acidic and you should add some lime, something like that. They usually have a message to tell you. Then it's also good to learn the toxic weedy species where animal health comes into play pretty quickly if they eat just a little bit. Those are pretty urgent to learn. And there's a lot of places to learn this from. Extension is great. If you get an extension agent out on your farm and just start pointing to things, not all of them have a PhD in botany or something. I mean, uh, their knowledge will be better than most people's, but still not like a formal botanist. But it's a great way to learn. That's how I've learned a lot of species here and back in Virginia. I would just talk to people who'd been doing it a long time and ask them a lot of stupid questions that weren't actually stupid and learn fantastic things. Another one is more experienced farmers and ranchers. And just be careful who you pick for this because some people will think that they know what a plant is and it's not actually that. So just be really sure that they're kind of like a recognized community expert on this kind of thing. Naturalist orgs and master gardeners, often very useful people for learning this as well, and local publications. Um, for Western Oregon, we've got some, and I'll go into that on a few pages down, I think, but there's a lot of different resources. And when it comes to toxic plants, it's another good reason, like I said, to learn plant ID. Um, the best defense against them is having good pasture. So don't worry too much about them if your pasture is in even modestly good shape. But um, it is good to know those. And this one on the right, it's a grass, and most people don't think of grass as being potentially toxic, but there's actually a lot of grasses that are potentially toxic for horses. And thankfully, most of them are not super common in the Willamette Valley. There's some that show up here and there, but this one actually does occur in Oregon. I don't think it has a lot of, I don't think actually it has any reported case studies of being a problem, but it's fall panicum. And that one back home in Virginia has killed a fair number, literally dozens of horses. So I'm glad it's not super common here, but it does actually exist here. So just little things like that. It's good to learn plant ID, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because there's a separate class for that. And don't get too scared by the process. There's over 1,000 documented species within like 10 miles of me. I'm not learning all of them. Um, I'm going to try because it's part of my job and my passion. But for you, you can get away with like 30. So again, just focus on what you see a lot of, what are toxic in your pastures potentially, and ask your extension agent about uh, ones that show up a lot or ones that concern you. And there's a few resources here. I assume we'll be sending out slides later, so you can just kind of click on these because these links are going to them. But I will say for learning what you want to plant, the third one here, pasture and grazing management in the Northwest, it's also the picture on the right. That is an entire book that is also a free PDF, and that pretty much goes into detail on every aspect of pasture and grazing management, including species selection and identification of useful pasture plants. It's not focused on horses, but it's a pretty good resource. And the field guide to the grasses of Oregon and Washington, I recommend this one mostly because it's the only game in town. Unfortunately, a lot of the pages are like, what does the seed head look like? And sure, at this time of year, I can grab a grass and be like, oh, it has a seed head and identify it that way. But much of the time in your pastures, you will not have a seed head, and this book will be of limited use. But if you are really interested in diving into that kind of thing, that one's potentially useful. Some of the more common species are perennial ryegrass, annual ryegrass, tall fescue, and orchard grass. And the first two, unless you have irrigated pastures and horses with high metabolic needs, high energy needs, I wouldn't really bother with those. Tall fescue and orchard grass are very persistent in unirrigated pastures, and those are pretty reliable in this region. They won't produce in summer because they are cool season grasses, but they will produce the rest of the year and they will last longer into June than the ryegrasses will. So just kind of a quick overview of those four grasses. I won't go too much into um, species differences here beyond that because that's kind of a whole lecture in and of itself. But the long and short of it is tall fescue and orchard grass, if you're wondering what to plant if you have new pasture or something, usually a good bet. And we'll go into the drawbacks in a little bit when it comes to laminitis. And this is what that advice looks like. The graze when the pasture is 8 inches tall and stop when it's 4 inches tall, take half, leave half kind of thing. That's kind of what that looks like in action. On the right, you can see the 8 to 12 inch zone. And then on the left, you can see it's actually closer to 5 inches at that point. So we haven't pulled the horses off there yet, but getting close to the 4 inch mark. And how do we do that? If you've only got one paddock in your pasture, you have to pretty much take the horses off and put them in the barn, which is not ideal to do all the time. So rotational grazing is our best bet, where we subdivide farm into multiple different paddocks. And it has a lot of benefits. It improves the utilization rate of the pasture, so you won't get, remember those roughs and greens and the golf course effects, where some of the pastures hit really hard and some of it's barely touched. It'll reduce that to an extent. And it allows for rest and regrowth of the grasses. So when the grass gets grazed by the horse and it needs some time to reinvest itself, get some solar panels out in the form of leaves, it gives it time to do that. It reduces the equine need for supplemental feeding because you're getting more productivity out of your grass. So that'll in turn lower your hay bill by increasing productivity. And here's an example. This was a little demonstration farm that I used to manage where we had two treatments or kind of two strategies. On the left side, where you don't see any fancy polygons and shapes of colors, we had 4 horses that just grazed all year round on that pasture. And then on the right side, with all of the fancy colors, we divided it into 4 primary grazing lanes, installed a heavy use area in the middle under that shed, basically an area that has several different layers of different stone types so that water can pass through, but the soil doesn't wash away and it's very trampling resistant. And then we subdivided those pastures, those 4 grazing lanes, just with 1 strand of electric wire. And that won't work for everyone, but it worked for us, and it worked with off-track thoroughbreds who were literally fresh off the track. So pretty rowdy geldings. So yeah, it was an interesting system, and we'll kind of show you what that looks like. And I will note before I go forward, one thing I liked about this was that on this particular pasture, there was a pretty steep hill that went from the shed on the bottom of that photo towards the top of the photo. And the fact that we were able to kind of divide the grazing lanes up and down the hill like that meant that the horses had to work to get across the field. That there was a constant hill. Anytime we moved them to a new pasture, they still had to go up and down the hill a lot. So that was pretty great for their tough lines. And also having the longer pasture like that gave them room to break into a gallop and actually attain like kind of a playful speed because they were geldings who needed to get their kicks out sometimes. This is what that system looks like. A lot of people think, oh, you can't get really even grazing with horses. Well, look at that photo. That's pretty even grazing. The only spots you see that are not grazed are spots where they have defecated, and I would not want them to graze. And it's pretty much picture perfect rotation right there. So on the left, you've got what the pasture that they're going to be moved into looks like, that beautiful 8 to 12 inches. And on the right, you've got the stubble that looks like a lawnmower went through it. So the grass recovers beautifully. the stuff on the right ends up after a month or so looking like the stuff on the left. And then you can graze it again. And there you can get kind of a better sense of what that even grazing looked like. You get those little piles here and there where they defecated, like I said, but for the most part, very even grazing. You don't have those roughs and greens. And we've got a question about cool and warm season species. I'll address that in a little bit. Thank you. Good question. So this is what it looks like when it's rested and the pasture is lush. Where we compare this to the other pasture, which was not subdivided, not rotationally grazed, you get areas, I circled them here because it's kind of hard to see in the photo, but areas that are untouched, and then areas that are just completely denuded or weedy. And this pasture was quite unhealthy, quite full of weeds. And the grazing pressure was exactly the same. Both sides had 4 horses, and actually the rotational side had slightly less pasture because we put in a heavy use area and a couple of warm season weighings. So now that I mentioned that, I'll go back to Terry's question. Terry asked in the chat if it would be good to have warm and cool season species in the pasture to help during summer for growth. And actually, if you look at this system, I mentioned the 4 grazing lanes in the different colors, but I didn't mention what, if you see like the G and F1, F2, those areas, those rectangles to the left and the right of the shed and the heavy use area. I never told you what those were. Those were actually warm season grass areas. They were Bermuda grass on one side, and the other is just tall fescue. It wasn't actually dedicated warm season, but we kind of held it as a stockpiled emergency reserve for grazing. But warm season grasses are kind of under researched in Oregon, so we can't really recommend to you, you should try this or that. But once we have a better idea of what grows well here, then it can be for some farms cost effective to have a small acreage dedicated just to growing summer forage. And I will say that sorghum Sudan has a lot of research in Oregon, but I would caution against feeding that one because it can cause cystitis ataxia, and that's kind of, for me, a deal breaker. Your risk tolerance may vary, but I'm not going to recommend that one. And TEF has some research, but it's not very grazing tolerant. It's better for hay. And other than that, there's not much out there. But I am doing some forage trials with warm season species, so I hope to get back to you on that. There are some that I know work well for the horses, but I'm not sure if they'll work well here in the soil, growing wise. So yeah, that's kind of a, I guess at this point I've covered this, but the left side I just kind of colored in where the horses grazed, and you can see that most of the pasture is not where they grazed. But going back to the heavy use area, I've talked a lot about grazing pressure, but hooves can do more long-term damage to pasture than grazing a lot of the time when it comes to horses. I mean, these are 1 to 2,000 pound animals going 45 miles per hour. That's not going to be inconsequential for soil, especially in a place like Oregon with very soft soils because of the moisture much of the year. And to that end, heavy use areas are really critical to reducing soil compaction and churning from hooves on wet days. That said, they're also expensive. There is no shortcut when it comes to a good heavy use area. It's possible to kind of have a sacrifice area that's not really heavy use area, but just kind of a sacrifice lot where you throw the horses in and just let it turn to mud. But there's a lot of potential drawbacks to that from animal health and environmental health if you can manage to do better. So I would urge you to if you can. Sometimes there are cost shares available from soil and water conservation districts, but not always. I think there's kind of a difficulty for horse owners, shall we say, to get cost shares in that arena sometimes, but it's still worth looking into. It's better to get a no from them than to not know at all. So I would ask them about that. Call your local SWCD. They're also useful. I mean, I've talked about the environmental and pasture benefits, but if you've got a horse that needs to be separated from the herd for a medical condition, or a horse that's about to founder, or a horse that's about to foal, heavy use areas can be a great little working arena for animals that have to be separated or receive extra special care. So now we've talked about the lamb side of things. I've only got 20 minutes left, but let's talk about the horse side of things a little bit more. So with pastures, well, I'll start over. A lot of horse people know exactly what they're feeding their horse in the barn. A fair number of horse people even know what kind of hay that they're feeding their horse. Maybe they just know that it's orchard grass, but some people I've met in Oregon, they have actual forage tests for their hay. But most people have no idea what's happening in their pastures. And that usually is the bulk and the majority of what the horse is eating. So that's something we need to change, because if you're planning with a diet of a large animal that has kind of special needs, and you're only aware of like 1/3 to maybe 1/2 of what's going into that animal, you can't really plan well. So that's something we need to kind of address. A really quick question from the chat. Katie asked, is it good to have dry lots for horses prone to founder? And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but it's an easy answer. That is, heck yeah. They are fantastic for horses that are prone to founder. It's one of the best management tools you can have. So back to the what are we feeding our horses idea. We need to know what's going into the horse. So the best way to do that is to do a forage test. I won't go into a lot of details on how to do that here, but it's if you Google how to do it, or I can include a link when we send out the slides in an email, a pretty straightforward ways to do it. You're essentially just clipping pasture to the same height that your horses are grazing. You put it in a bag, send it to a lab, and get something back that looks a little bit like the photo on the right, with a lot of different numbers, and some of them are more important than others, but for horses, pretty much all of them are going to matter at some point, except for TDM, that's more of a cow thing. But yeah, essentially, we want to know what's going into the horses, the majority of what's going into the horses, so we can actually target the supplements we feed them a little bit better. Like that first photo I showed where we saw that copper, zinc, and selenium were deficient for a lot of pastures. If we know that about our pasture, then we can get a ration balancer that addresses those three things. And if we know that everything else, literally everything else that the horse needed was being met by the pasture, then we don't have to feed this, that, and the other thing that costs $70 from SmartPack. So it might be a little bit of an upfront cost to do a forage test, but ultimately it will save you money. And I cannot stress how useful they are for horses. For a lot of beef people, I'm like, don't worry about it too much, because beef is pretty much straightforward. You want lots of energy and this and that. But horses, there's a lot of amino acids that you want to have. There's a lot of, it can get complicated, but it's very important to start diving into that. And unfortunately, there is no shortcut to that complication. I'm still learning stuff. I've got my PhD with literal equine digestibility research, and I'm still not like super great about mineral ratios and things like that. So it's going to be scary. There's no easy way to do it. I can't tell you it will get better because it's just hard. But you need to do it for your horse's well-being. So forage tests. That's the punchline there. So yeah, you'll see something like this ultimately if you put all that stuff into a spreadsheet. Like I said, you can identify these are the 3 nutrients I need. And these are the many other things my horse has quite enough of. I don't need to supplement. So now moving on, another thing you might see in a forage test is NSC, that's non-structural carbohydrates. You might also see NFC, I always forget what the F is. Melissa, can you save my life here? I never used NFC. Anyways, it's like non-structural carbohydrates, but you throw pectin into the mix. That's really all it is. Non-fibrous. There we go. Finally remembered. Gosh, it's not even a Monday. But yeah, essentially those carbohydrates, NSC, non-structural, and NFC, non-fibrous carbohydrates, are both the things that are not the cell walls of the plant. So you think about a piece of paper, it's being held up by carbohydrates, essentially, woody materials and things like that. And it's the same for grasses. The thing that holds this stalk of grass upright is carbohydrates. But what the NSC and the NFC are talking about are not the ones that are structural ones in the grass holding it upright. It's the simple sugars, water-soluble carbohydrates, starches, pectin, those things that are ultimately not part of the structure of the plant, but are still nutritionally relevant. So what are we looking at here in this graph? The red line is 12% of non-structural carbohydrates. It is the literal red line for a lot of horses prone to laminitis. Between 10 and 12% is the maximum recommended intake of non-structural carbohydrates for these grasses. So that red line is like, if we're above that, it's not good for horses prone to obesity and laminitis. And the green line is where the pasture that I measured was over the course of a year, 2015 to 2016. You can see that there's not a whole lot of time it spends in the safe zone for a horse that's prone to laminitis. And that's in Virginia, this pasture. And Oregon has a lot more grass and a lot happier pastures than Virginia. So I haven't seen numbers here. If I had, I would have put them up instead of these, but that's one example. Here's another one. I helped out on this study for a year as well, different pasture, also in Virginia though. And you can see the non-structural carbohydrates, water-soluble and ethanol-soluble, all there over the course of a year. And we measured this once a week, well, actually twice a week, for an entire year straight. And you can just see the fluctuations. So going back to the idea of 10 to 12% non-structural carbs is kind of a safe level for a horse prone to obesity and laminitis. You can see that much of the year we are well above that, sometimes the 25% non-structural carbs. So that's something to keep in mind. And here's another carb graph. This is time of day instead of time of year. One in April and another in May. So in April, if you look on the leftmost graph, you can see that at 6 in the morning, there's not a whole lot of carbs, and then it goes up, and by 6 p.m., it's higher. Then same thing the next day, 6 in the morning, 18%. I mean, that's still a lot, but it's relatively lower. And then come 6 p.m., you're at 24% on that particular day. So pretty wide variation in the percentage of non-structural carbs based on time of day. And it's pretty intuitive why that is. The sun was set during the night, so in the morning, the grass didn't have any extra byproducts of photosynthesis. It had been churning out carbohydrates from photosynthesis. But then by 6 p.m., there'd been a full saturated day of sunlight, and the grass had churned out a lot of carbohydrates. Now, this is tying all of that to the horse side of things, keeping in mind those wigglies for the grass before. Now the wiggly lines are insulin in the horses. And you can see essentially that so blue is horses that were eating hay, and their insulin on the left, that's the equine insulin, it stays pretty constant throughout. And then the horses that were grazing, that's the red line on the left, theirs varied, and it mirrored the grass, which is the green line, almost perfectly, just a couple hours delay between the horse and the grass, sometimes even less than that. So the insulin in the horse's blood was spiking when the grass was high in carbs, and it was lower as soon as the kind of nighttime fell and the grass ran out of gas. So what do we do with this information? Carbs are dangerous. Almost every horse person know that. And what do we do about that? Well, before I tell you that, there's one more time to be worried, and that's spring turnout in Oregon. If you've kind of tried to protect your pastures by keeping your horses in a sacrifice slot or heavy use area during the winter, the first time that it seems like the ground is suitable to turn them out, you're thinking, I want to put them out there and see them run again and have fun in the pasture. It's good to be cautious and kind of do it in little baby doses, because if your horses have been on hay all winter and then you turn them out into beautiful April grass, then that's also a pretty vulnerable time for colic and laminitis. So Fill the horses up on hay and regular supplements before you turn them out, and reduce the turnout time. Don't give them like a full day at first. Just give them a few hours, maybe of playtime, and then bring them in, and then a little bit more the next day. And then maybe after a few days, you can feel safe about it. It actually takes around 2 weeks for horses' hind guts to adjust to new feeds. Usually the microbiome or the little bugs that live in the horse's gut usually take a couple weeks to adjust to new feed. But usually we don't have that kind of time. But a few days of acclimatizing them usually goes a long way to preventing laminitis. Oh yeah, I forgot about this graph. One of the drawbacks to rotational grazing, it's great for the grass, but it does mean that you'll have around 1 or 2% higher non-structural carbohydrates, um, in this case, water soluble carbohydrates, in the rotational pasture because the grass is happier. Sometimes happier grass means it's more dangerous for the horses, but at 10.5 versus 12%, it's not a massive enough difference that I would say if they don't do rotational grazing based on this. But how do we know if our horses are at risk? There's a pretty easy way to tell without needing to necessarily do a blood test. And actually, insulin tests for horses are notoriously difficult to reliably do and interpret correctly. But body condition scoring is not. It's straightforward, it's cheap, it's easy, and it's something you should be doing if you're not already. It's very crucial to maintaining healthy horses. Usually ranges from 1 to 9, 1 being a horse that's emaciated and 9 being a horse that has fat rolls on the fat rolls. And the average scores are taken from 6 regions of the body to do this BCS. And for an athlete, you want to aim for a 4 or 5 BCS. For a horse that's just kind of living its life at maintenance, not a super high performer, just kind of trail rides now and then, 5 or a 6. And if the horse is a broodmare who's really going to need a lot of nutritional reserves to draw upon to keep her foal healthy, then usually a BCS of 6 is pretty good. Beyond that, you're actually causing more problems for the foaling process than you've resolved, but a little on the thicker side, better. Just to kind of illustrate that range, top left, we've got 4 or lower. I would say that's more of a 2 or a 3 than a less than 4 is not super descriptive. So I'll say that one's a 2 or a 3. The one in the middle, that one I would say is around 5, but usually it's good to feel them and not just eyeball it. So word of caution there. And then on the right, we've got something that's a little bit more than an 8. There are also breed variations in this too. Like some of the things might not feel super applicable when you read through how to do a BCS score for thoroughbreds, for example. Like the withers will almost never have fat on a lot of thoroughbreds. Or yeah, there's some slight differences, but that's why it's 6 different regions across the horse that you'll measure, and you will come up with a pretty reasonable result from that. There's been a lot of research into that, and we've used it heavily on our extensive laminitis related research at the Veterinary Center. The other one is the crusty neck score. So body condition scoring does involve many parts of the horse, but one that we want to focus on, especially for laminitis and predicting the potential for a horse to have a laminitic episode, is the crusty neck. For some reason or another, there is a genetic link between horses depositing fat in the crest of their neck and horses that are prone to insulin resistance and the equine equivalent of type 2 diabetes. So if the horse has a crest and it's not a stallion, and it's like a fatty crest and not a kind of cartilaginous crest that a stallion would have, then that is an indication that it's going to be susceptible to laminitis. And there's a ton of research to back this up, so you can rely on it like clockwork pretty much. And it's actually one of the ways, part of our research on that farm were warm blood horses, and they were incredibly prone to laminitis. And our way to monitor them to make sure they didn't founder was heavily relying on this. So I can't really overstate how useful this is if you have horses that are prone to laminitis. Monitoring body condition and the crusty neck score are 2 of the best things you can do to predict problems you might have. So what are some strategies for the easy keeper? We want to manage the timing of grazing, keeping in mind the seasonal variation we saw in non-structural carbohydrates, and also the time of day even mattered to how much sugar is in the grass. So every day, kind of think about what weather you've had and if the grass is potentially nuclear and its carbohydrate levels. I will say that there are a few different kind of weather patterns that really lend themselves to grass that's high in non-structural carbs. So really sunny days that are cool, like in the upper 30s, low 40s, those are usually pretty much the danger zone because it's sunny enough and warm enough for the grass to photosynthesize, but it's not warm enough for it to grow a whole lot, which means it's making a lot of carbs, but then the carbs are not directly converted into parts of the plant itself. It's not growing and converting them. So it's just kind of stockpiling a boatload of sugars. And that's a problem. Another time is if you've had kind of a lot of sunshine and then hard frost out of the blue. Um, Carbohydrates in grasses are also an antifreeze. Grasses will literally mobilize carbohydrates from the roots to prevent their cell walls from bursting with a freeze or a frost. So when a frost happens, the sugar's up in the plant. So that kind of thing is kind of stuff to keep in mind. That's stuff I keep in mind, particularly when I was making racing decisions for my mare, or should I put a muzzle on her today, or that kind of thing. And actually, I still keep track of it from a distance and kind of nag the farm manager now and then, like, oh, I saw the weather's been blah, blah, blah lately. Is she in a grazing muzzle? So pretty crucial to decision making. Managing what is eaten by the horse, hay or pasture, that's another thing that you can address pretty directly. As you can recall from that study I showed with the blue line, the hay group, the insulin was pretty much straightforward and constant. And you can manage how much the horse is eating. That's kind of the last big one. So how do we do those things? Grazing muzzles and dry lots are two of the most useful ways to do that. And I'm going to say right off the bat with the grazing muzzle, if you were putting that on for 12 hours and then taking it off because your horse made puppy eyes at you, know that the research says the horse can pack in just as much with the 12 on, 12 off cycle as a horse that does not have a muzzle at all. So you're essentially just punishing both of you at that point. And the same goes even, there's been research on, it's either minis or Shetlands, I forget which, but they did muzzles for 21 hours a day and then took them off for 3 hours a day. And they measured how much the horses ate. And I'll tell you right now, they ate in 3 hours their entire ration for the day of grass, 2 to 3% of their body weight. And when you do it in 2 or 3 hours, that's even higher risk of laminitis for the animal because it's not spread out. It's just spiking their blood sugar like a kid that just ate a box of Skittles. And unlike the kid with a box of Skittles, it can kill the horse. So it's best if you're doing a grazing muzzle, commit to the darn thing, leave it on if the horse is on pasture. And then if you want them to have a little bit of rest without the muzzle, bring them in. Take them into the sacrifice lot or the heavy use area, or bring them into the barn, and then make that the playtime without the muzzle. And that goes to the second point, which I've already kind of hammered home a lot. Dry lots are super useful for flexibility with this sort of thing. You can control every single thing that's going into the horse if they are on a dry lot. And pasture and exercise are very important, as we talked about. But if it's the difference between the horse dying and not dying, then a dry lot sounds great too. And here's another aspect to this. So I mentioned the hay being a pretty constant thing. Some hay can still be too high for horses prone to laminitis. So if you look at the NSC, the non-structural carbs in this, we're at 8 to 18% for grass hay, 8 to 13 for legume, 15 to 29 for oat hay. So a pretty wide variation. And some of that grass is going to be outside of the kind of safe zone for horses prone to laminitis. So what can we do about that? You can soak the hay. And a lot of people have a lot of different theories about the best way to soak hay, but thank goodness there's science because Krishona Martinson over at the University of Minnesota researched hot water, cold water, and different soaking times, and different types of hay, alfalfa versus orchard grass and things like that. And the long and the short of it is if you soak 15 to 30 minutes, hot water is better, but cool water is just fine. you're not going to get a huge benefit past the 15 to 30-minute mark. As you can see on the graphs here, there's a pretty sharp decline from 0 to 15 minutes in the carbohydrates. And then after that, you might lose another 10-20% at the 30-minute mark, and then it's kind of flatlining. So 15 to 30 minutes of soaking. You don't really have to do it all night long or do it in the morning, feed it in the afternoon. It's pretty easy. Thankfully, saves a lot of effort in what is still a pretty effortful process and sloppy, nasty process, but also a very safe bet for horses prone to laminitis. There's some other potential options out there. I helped out on a study that was looking at novel turf grasses for horses, and the goal was twofold. One, we wanted something that had low carbs and high productivity, and also something that could tolerate hoof traffic from horses. And here's a full list of the cool season grasses we tested. We also did warm season grasses. That's a different list entirely. This was across the US, so I'm not going to generalize too much from it. But you will note there is creeping bent grass on this list. And I have seen a lot of creeping bent grass in Western Oregon, I have to say. It is dense. It doesn't produce a really tall sward. It's kind of low growing, so it makes the horse work for what it grazes. It was traffic tolerant when we tested it. It had low non-structural carbohydrates, and the horses thought it tasted like crap, which is great if the horse is prone to laminitis. So creeping bent grass, I will note, after all of those many things I just sang his praises about, it's a weedy species, and your neighbors will not thank you for seeding it. So I'm not going to straight up say you should plant that on your farm if you have horses with laminitis. But I will say there's research suggesting it is very beneficial to horses with laminitis. And neighbors matter, and you should be a good neighbor too. So I've been talking a while, and just summarize it now, but let's take inventories of our forage base, know what you're working with, what species you've got, what the nutritive value of it is. And one thing I forgot to mention is that will change throughout the year. Obviously the carbs did, so will the vitamins and things like that. So you'll have to take a few forage samples, like a spring one, a summer one, and a fall one. But it's pretty fun. And honest to God, it's one of the most important things you can do for your horse's health too. You want to balance the supply and the demand, how much grass you're growing, how much your horse is eating, and monitor the pastures and the horses constantly. They're pretty similar in as much as if you treat your pasture like a horse, make it work a little bit, it'll be healthier. But if you don't work it at all, it's going to be pretty rank and nasty. And if you work it too hard, there's going to be nothing left. It'll be run into the ground. So just find that kind of Goldilocks zone where the pasture is being worked, the horse is being worked, but nothing's being worked too hard. And moderation in all things will carry you a long way. So with that, I think we're all collapsed in the paddock and ready for, oh, there's 4 chats, God help me. Oh, fantastic, they're great questions. And a wonderful link from Melissa. Katie asked, can laminitis be reversed or stopped if taken off the grass? Rotation in the hoof is generally irreversible, but it can be stopped when taken off the grass. There's going to be a little bit of a delay because the inflammatory response in the horse will not stop immediately just from removing the horse from pasture. Long term, the rotation in the hoof can be mitigated by corrective shoeing, supplements, growing the sole out, things like that. But once the bone, the coffin bone rotates within the hoof, that distal phalanx is not coming back up. It's not going to reverse. And I think that's a pretty common misconception that it's just going to somehow flip itself back up. It doesn't. Laminitis is forever, and it can be mitigated, but it's a permanent thing. My horse foundered 4 years ago from Cushing's rather than pasture stuff. Ironically, it was when I was writing my dissertation on prevention of laminitis, but hers was chemical rather than nutritional founder. But she's still got the rotation there. It's pretty much a forever thing. So good question. Should you mow to break up poop or drag the field? That's a great question. One of the aspects of manure management is parasites. There's going to be parasites in manure, and if you have a robust plan to do fecal egg counts for your horses regularly and kind of know where you're at, um, then that's something I would recommend doing if you're not kind of doing that already. But yeah, spreading manure, if it's not going to be grazed for a little while, is good. And the next question people always ask is, well, how long is a while? And the answer is it depends on the weather. Because what we're waiting on is the manure to break down, of course, but also for the parasites to die. And a lot of the parasites that live in horse species like moist weather, they don't like sunlight. And so Oregon is kind of a paradise for them. And what does kill them is dry weather and heat and sunlight. So when you spread manure, just kind of keep in mind that you're going to probably see elevation and how spread out across the field the parasite load is, and keep track of your fecal egg counts. I wish there was like an easy number to say, like, wait 4 weeks after spreading it before grazing, but I haven't seen those data for Oregon because no one's researched it here. And it is very much a local environmental thing. So spreading poop can be great from the standpoint of helping it break down. But to be honest, a lot of the time, given the weather that I just mentioned, poop breaks down pretty fast here in the first place. So unless you're on a really fast rotation, in which case you don't want the parasite loads, I would just let the poop break down on its own most of the time if it's spread out across the field and not like a super ridiculous brown patch everywhere. So yeah, hope that answered it. It was pretty vague, non-answer in a lot of ways, but generally I think just letting poop sit there is fine. It's the short answer. The next question is, can mowing be beneficial to weed control or preventing grass from going to seed? Mowing can be useful in a number of ways. So one of the management strategies I didn't talk about for laminitis is mowing. It actually does help with that too, because it's depleting the carbohydrates in the grass. There's been a lot of research on does mowing help with preventing pasture-associated laminitis? And the answer is yes. And when it comes to weed control, that's going to depend on timing. If you have some weed seeds that grow, let's say 8 inches tall, and they've already set seed, and then you go and mow them, it's kind of like the parasite issue where you are spreading them out instead of just letting them fall where they are. So if you mow at the wrong time, you're actually spreading the weeds out more. So that's going to come down to what weed species you're mowing and at what stage of growth the weed species is. If it's about to set seed but still hasn't, that's usually a great time to mow. But the trick is knowing what species it is and knowing when that part of the lifespan happens for timing that. As for preventing grass from going to seed, mowing definitely does that. Just try to not mow too often or too low if you want your grass to stay healthy and strong. It's kind of that similar 8-inch to 4-inch rule. I don't think too many mowers I've seen go to 8 inches, but if you can just kind of mow to 4-inch height and not down to 2 or something like that, that'll be better for the grass. And next question was, should you spray for weeds when horses are off the pasture being sprayed, of course? And since I am now the organic pasture and forage person at OSU, my first response would be weeds are a symptom of something bigger, and spraying is a short-term solution to a long-term issue most often. If you're seeing a lot of weeds, it usually indicates something's going on in the soil or something with your grazing management, or there's a number of other things it could be, but it's always telling you something needs to change. It's nature's Band-Aid. Nature doesn't put on a Band-Aid if there's not an injury. So you can spray. There's no law against it unless you're spraying off label or whatever, in which case there's federal laws against it. But I would advise that spraying be part of the toolkit and not the first shortcut out of a bad management situation. Terry asked, we have maple trees on the side of the pasture. How are maples bad for horses? I think it's a couple of maple species. I think silver maple and another one. And it's when the branch falls off the tree, it produces, I believe, a precursor to cyanide in the leaves. And I'll have to double check. Yeah, Melissa says red maple. I think I saw research on silver maple too. So it's Red maple's the big one though. So yeah, maple is, if it's on your fence line, just kind of be cautious after a storm. If you see a lot of leaves or branches that have fallen, just try to get those off the pasture. And other than that, not too much of a worry. Vine and big leaf maple, Melissa says, are not a problem in Oregon. They're native to Oregon and not a problem.
Yep, that's right. So you just need to identify the maple trees as well as some of those forages in your pasture, it sounds like. Shayan, I have a couple questions. When you said mowing to help prevent laminitis, one thing that we always talk about with cool season grasses is that some of those carbohydrates are stored in the bottom couple inches of the plant and the crown of the plant. Is that true? I mean, based on your knowledge? So I don't know. I'm wondering if I'm giving wrong information.
That depends on the species. Like some, they'll have kind of they'll allocate the carbs differently depending on the species. Some will definitely put more in the stems, and some pretty evenly between stem and leaf, and others will just chunk a lot of it into the roots unless they really need it. But when it comes to the balance of how that impacts the horse, a lot of the time, volume and how much is going into the horse will matter even more than just like how much of the NSC is just in the plant that it's grazing. So kind of translate it differently. If a horse eats a small amount of a high carb thing versus a large amount of a medium carb thing, you're going to get more carbs in the horse through the second one. So even though there's some plants have more carbs in the leaves, you're also just chopping off a lot of the carbs with mowing. And then a lot of the carbs that are in that plant will be mobilized to grow new tissue. So pretty soon you'll have that turnaround in the plant. I could try to find that research real quick too.
So if they're mowing, would it be important to keep the horses off that mowed pasture for a while so they're not eating all that kind of bulk leaf material that's been mowed off?
Yeah, definitely. If it's not bagged and removed from the pasture, then it's not great to have horses eating mowed grass, mostly for the mold issue. And also, I mean, if they're laminitic, then that's definitely an issue as well. So yes, bag it or wait a little bit.
I'm not dominating question and answer time. So if you have questions, you can turn off you can unmute yourself and ask or put your question in the chat. But I have one more question for you about the forage sampling. Do you feel, so like, what is the protocol for sending in a fresh sample? I would be afraid it would mold in a bag. So is it better to let it dry out a little bit, or how do you handle that when sending it to lab?
Kind of a funny issue of my background is that we had forage ovens where I worked, and so I literally never did a home sample. It was always like I dried them in a forage oven dedicated to the task before mailing them off, and often I actually had to grind hundreds of samples too. So like anyways, it was a pretty drawn out process, but I'm going to link an example of the.
Okay, I've only taken I've only sent in dried hay samples. I've never actually sent in forage samples for my pasture. So I will look into that more. It looks like you have some more questions in the chat also.
Yeah, and that will differ by lab. So I'm just sending one example here. And let's see, in this example, they say to freeze the sample overnight. That will kind of elevate the carbs a little bit, but not to the point where it's going to matter in terms of management. So Rachel is asking, going back to Natalia's question, once mowed, how long in days? pretty much just until the grass that you mowed is not a big kind of edible pile for the horse. So if it looks like it's dispersed pretty quickly, then you can graze it pretty quickly. But keep in mind that that will mean the pasture is going to be hit a little bit harder because it's getting the double whammy of the mowing and the horse. So that's why this isn't really my first choice for managing for laminitis. In fact, it would be my actual last choice. There's really no benefit to this one compared to like the four other things that we talked about. Muzzles are just so much easier and just as useful. You don't have to do all this mowing. The grass can be happy and the horse can be healthy at the same time. They're $35 as opposed to however much you'll spend per year in gasoline with current gas prices mowing your lawn or pasture. So really there's not a whole lot of reasons I would advise mowing beyond just if your horse is grazing unevenly and you want to tighten up the pasture a little bit, knock down some seed heads, or if you are doing weed control because you know that the weed is not producing seeds yet and you want to knock it back a little bit. Those are pretty much the only two times I ever would mow a pasture. The rest of the time you're just kind of losing money. Rachel asked, can giving access to various browse be healthy, like shrubby species, hawthorn, rose, purea, or blackberry? There's some very limited number of species that we know can work with that, and I can't think of too many off the top. And by and large, the answer is not really. So if we think back to, let's see, I think I'm still screen sharing. Yep. We go back quite a ways. I hope this doesn't induce seizures in anyone. Good Lord. The picture on the right here, not a whole lot of trees or browse there, and this is where horses evolved. Siberia, Mongolia, they are steppe creatures, steppe with a PE on the end of it. So yeah, Central Asian grasslands with almost no trees, no browse, just grass and whatever little broadleaf forbs they can find. That said, I've read stories about indigenous peoples in the Americas overwintering their horses on cottonwood and willow groves and things like that. But do we have nutritional research on it? No. Would I be worried about impaction colic? Hell yes. So there's nothing I will recommend on that front. Is it a very interesting question that I'd love to research if I weren't the organic pasture person and were instead the equine forage researcher for Oregon? I'd be on that, yeah, for sure. So great question. I wish I had a better answer.
Do we have any other questions tonight about any of the topics that Shayan covered?
I've got a question. You mentioned that blood testing for insulin was, I forget the word you used, but it sounded like not great or not really reliable. I guess I'm wondering, I've heard like fasting versus non-fasting, and if you have any tips or ideas about how to get better testing for insulin resistance and equine metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, that one is just a tad outside of my wheelhouse. Like I've helped take enough blood samples, dozens actually,
Okay.
that I'm really familiar with the process beyond what most lay persons are, but I think an equine nutritionist is who I would need to consult for that. But the ones that I've spoken to about it pretty much kind of, they do BCS on their horses. They don't actually rely on the insulin too much. The only time we actually did do a lot of insulin testing for the horses was for scientific research, and it was very specific protocols. Like we would give a bolus of Caro sugar syrup, certain number based on the animal's weight, so it would have X percentage of carbs in its system. And then we would take blood samples every 1, 5, 15, etc. minutes. And it was always for scientific stuff. So that said, I'm not enough of an expert to tell you which one to try. I've just heard enough from experts that I'm like, it's probably just easier to keep doing BCS and CNS because that's what I see the experts doing with their own horses.
Okay, thanks.
As you could see too, let's go back to the blood sugar ones. I have those around past here. Sorry for the screen flashing, I'm sure that's obnoxious. So yeah, you can see how much the insulin fluctuated in these horses on pasture throughout the day. And even the ones that were on hay, you see little spikes here and there. So definitely a wiggly thing. And you can see the general trend as well. So ultimately there is a message here from the blood sample. It's not worthless, otherwise we wouldn't take it, but it is very much, if you're only taking one sample, then yeah, there's a lot of variables that are going to impact that. Okay, 2 more questions. It looks like Don asked, is it more harmful to have horses out in saturated pastures when having a lot of rain than to rest it a few days? I'm not sure what the resting harm would be. So if you could clarify that, I'll just say that it is great to have pasture rested when it's raining. I don't see harm in the resting part of that question. So if you could clarify the question, not sure I get it. And Natalia asked, what is the ideal amount of grazing time for basic maintenance boarded horse? Not too much, not too little. They have fat quarter horses and Arabians. And essentially, all the time, if they have a grazing muzzle and it seems that their BCS and CNS are good, it's just so dependent on the individual horse as to what situation will work for them. But my Arabian is prone to laminitis thanks to her Cushing's, and she's a real easy keeper. She was even before the Cushing's. And she is out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because she has a grazing muzzle. And I get photos regularly of her, and her BCS looks the same as I want it to, and like it did before I moved to Oregon. So it seems to work for her. So essentially, try grazing muzzles. That's the cheapest one. And if that's not an option, then think about sacrifice lots and hay, and that gets expensive real fast. But if the grazing muzzle doesn't work, that's really the only reliable way to address it. Or you could try the mowing thing, but you'll end up with not a whole lot of grass without too long. Don clarified them being locked in rather than being out grazing. So when it comes to horse health, being in the stall is almost never ideal. However, the pasture being nuked is also not ideal. So that's why the sacrifice lot comes in handy. If you can have one, that would be the best solution. If you can't have one, oof, at that point, yeah, it is going to come down to which one can I prioritize right now, the horse's happiness and exercise and health, or the pasture's survival. And if you started out with a really good pasture because you've been managing it the ways we talked about, then it can take a little bit more abuse. So when those occasions arise, you can turn the horses out for a little bit, and they can hit the pasture a little hard, and it'll bounce back faster than if you started out with a bad pasture. So I hope that kind of clarifies, but that's kind of, without seeing your pastures and your horses, can't tell you exactly what I'd do, but it's essentially make sure you have a strong pasture to start with, and you can make that decision. Jim asked, isn't another solution to feed less nutrient dense hay? 16 plus hours a day, the horse needs to keep something in the stomach, reducing the chance of ulcers. And yes, we did discuss that. The hay solution is useful. One thing I'll add to that, if you have a horse that's a really easy keeper and prone to laminitis, and soaking the hay is a pain, or you soak the hay and then they finish it within an hour or two, and then you don't want to feed them 15 times a day, there's a lot of hay nets and slow feeders out there, and there's a lot of research on those too that shows that certain types do work really well. So find the type that works for you and your horse. It'll slow down the hay intake rate while maintaining a constant buffer or feed presence in their stomach, so it prevents the ulcers. So the horse won't gain weight, but it will always have something to nibble on. Good for the mental health and good for the stomach lining.
As we're wrapping up tonight, I want to thank everyone for coming out. Well, I guess you don't have to come very far. You just turned on your screen, so that was cool.